The main hall of Concordance Prime was the largest gathering space on the station. A vast amphitheater designed to accommodate representatives from every species in the galactic community. And it had not been filled to capacity in nearly a decade. Today, every seat was occupied. Word had spread through the station overnight about the human girl who had faced General Kethvorin and remained standing. And rumors had multiplied and grown until the entire Academy was buzzing with speculation about what would happen next. Most assumed punishment was coming, because the Draconori did not tolerate anything they perceived as disrespect. And the general's request to address the full cadet body could only mean that he intended to make an example of someone. Una sat in the front row with bandages visible on her forehead and arms, and Talvin and Chirik flanked her on either side with expressions that suggested they were prepared to die defending their friend if necessary. Whatever happens, Talvin whispered, "Know that we are proud to have known you. Nothing bad is going to happen," Una replied calmly. "The general is not here to punish anyone." "How can you possibly know that?" Chirik clicked with obvious anxiety. Una smiled. The first real smile her friends had seen from her since the assessment. "Because I asked him the right question before either of them could respond." General Kethvorin entered through the main doors and walked to the central platform, his guards notably absent and his ceremonial armor replaced with simpler attire that made him look somehow more approachable. The hall fell silent as he took his position, and every eye in the chamber fixed on the massive Draconori with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "I came to this academy believing I understood the natural order of the galaxy," Kethvorin began, his voice carrying easily through the space without any need for amplification. "I believed that strength was the only measure that mattered, and that species who lacked physical power existed to serve those who possessed it." He paused and scanned the crowd, his amber eyes moving slowly across rows of faces from dozens of different worlds. "I was wrong," a murmur rippled through the hall, because those three words in that particular order had likely never been spoken by a Draconori general in recorded history. "Yesterday, I faced a human cadet in combat," Kethvorin continued. "She was smaller than me in every dimension, weaker by any objective measure, and possessed no weapons or special abilities that could threaten my safety." His gaze found Una in the front row, and something passed between them that the watching cadets could not quite interpret. "She took everything I gave her," the general said. "Every strike, every blow, every attempt to knock her down. And she rose again each time with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. And when the assessment ended, she was still standing." He stepped away from the platform and began walking among the seated cadets, his massive form passing through their midst as he spoke. "But that was not what changed my understanding," he said. "Warriors can endure pain, and stubbornness is not unique to any species. So mere physical persistence would not have been enough to alter my beliefs." He stopped beside Una's seat and looked down at her with an expression that held neither condescension nor challenge. "What changed my understanding was the question she asked me afterward," he said. "She asked what the Draconori were running from that we needed to prove our strength so badly." Silence filled the hall as the implications of those words spread through the assembled cadets. "I have spent 300 years building an empire based on dominance and fear," Kethvorin continued. "My people have conquered dozens of systems and subjugated hundreds of species. And in all that time, no one has ever asked why we felt the need to do so." He turned to address the entire assembly once more. "The answer is that we were running from the fear of irrelevance," he said. "We built our civilization on the belief that physical strength was the only form of power that mattered. And we conquered others to prove that belief true. But deep down we always knew that strength alone cannot last forever." A Corvin faculty member rose from his seat, his expression skeptical. "With respect, General, what does any of this have to do with the operation of the Academy?" Everything, Kethvorin replied. Because I came here to break the spirit of weaker species and instead had my own assumptions shattered by a 17-year-old human girl. He walked back to the central platform and raised his voice to ensure everyone could hear his next words clearly. I am recommending humanity for full partnership status in the Galactic Council. The hall erupted in shocked conversation, because partnership status was reserved for elder species who had proven their value over millennia. And humanity had only achieved faster than light travel within the last century. You cannot be serious. The Corvin faculty member protested. The humans have no fleet to speak of, no ancient heritage, no established presence in galactic affairs. They have something better, Kethvorin responded. They have the capacity to look at a superior force and refuse to be intimidated. They have the wisdom to ask questions that cut to the heart of matters. And they have something my people lost long ago. What is that? Someone called from the crowd, hope, the general said simply. The hope that comes from believing that any obstacle can be overcome through persistence and courage. And the hope that strength is not measured only in physical power, but in the willingness to stand for what you believe. He turned to face Yuna directly, and his voice softened, though it still carried to every corner of the hall. Any species that produces children who can stand, bleeding before a general and ask what he is running from has earned not subjugation, but respect, he said. And my people would be wise to seek humanity as allies rather than subjects. The assembly sat in stunned silence as Kethvorin gave a formal bow toward Yuna, a gesture of recognition that no Dragonori general had offered to any species in living memory, and then walked out of the hall without another word. Hours later, after the assembly had dispersed and the station had begun processing what had happened, Yuna sat in the dormitory common room with Talvin and Chirik. What did you do to him? Talvin asked, his amphibian features still showing traces of amazement. How did you change the mind of a 300-year-old conqueror in a single day? Yuna shrugged and took a sip of the tea that Chirik had prepared for her. I just stood there and asked him a question. That cannot be the whole story. Chirik clicked with obvious frustration. It is. Though, Yuna said, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to act the way someone expects, because it forces them to question their assumptions about how the universe works. She looked out the viewport at the stars beyond, and somewhere among them, Kethvorin's ship was already departing, carrying a general who was no longer quite the same being he had been when he arrived. My grandmother taught me that fear is a gift you give to those who want to control you, Yuna said quietly. But she also taught me something else that I did not mention before. What was that? Talvin asked. She taught me that the opposite of fear is not courage, Yuna replied. The opposite of fear is understanding, because when you truly understand another being, you can see past their threats to the vulnerability beneath. And that understanding is more powerful than any weapon. In his quarters aboard the departing ship, General Kethvorin stood at the viewport and watched Concordance Prime shrink into the distance. He thought about the question Yuna had asked him, and he thought about the answer he had finally found within himself. And he thought about what it might mean for his people if they could learn to seek allies instead of subjects. The Draconori had built their empire on strength, but perhaps it was time to build something new on wisdom. Perhaps it was time to learn what humans knew about surviving not through dominance, but through persistence, not through fear, but through hope. Perhaps it was time to stop running. He turned away from the viewport and began composing a message to the Draconori Council, knowing that the words he was about to write would change the course of galactic history, and somewhere on a station full of cadets from 100 different worlds, a 17-year-old human girl finished her tea and returned to her studies, because tomorrow there would be more lessons to learn and more questions to ask. That was what humans did. After all, they never stopped. The crowd began to stir with whispers and shifting bodies as the assessment officially concluded. But General Kethvorn raised one hand, and the chamber fell silent once more. "The class is dismissed," he announced, his eyes never leaving the battered human girl who still stood before him, except for Cadet Park, who will remain for additional evaluation. Fear flickered across the faces of the other cadets, and Talvin half rose from his seat with obvious intention to protest. But Yuna caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. It was the first voluntary movement she had made since entering the ring that was not related to absorbing the general's attacks. And somehow that tiny gesture carried more authority than all the commands Kethvorn had issued that morning. The chamber emptied slowly as cadets filed out with frequent backward glances. And Chirrut lingered at the door till one of the Draconori guards stepped forward with clear menace in his posture. Then Yuna was alone, with the general and his two soldiers in the vast, empty space of the evaluation arena. "Leave us," Kethvorn ordered his guards. They hesitated, exchanging glances that suggested this was highly irregular. But the general's tone left no room for argument, and they retreated through the main entrance to take up positions. Just outside, the silence that followed was different from before, carrying less tension and more weight, as if the space itself recognized that something important was about to happen. Yuna remained standing where the assessment had ended, her blood now drying on her face and her bruises already beginning to darken. But she made no move toward the medical station along the wall. "You may sit," Kethvorn said, and his voice had lost much of its earlier harshness. "I did not hold back as much as I intended, and your injuries deserve attention." "I will stand," Yuna replied. And these were the first words she had spoken directly to him. "With respect, General, if you wish to have this conversation with me seated, you should have hit harder." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Kethvorn's scaled features, and he lowered himself to sit on the raised edge of the arena floor, bringing his eyes closer to her level, though he still towered above her. "Why?" he asked. Simply. Yuna tilted her head in a gesture he was beginning to recognize. "Why what, General? Why did you not surrender?" he clarified. "Why did you not show fear when every instinct should have screamed at you to submit? And why did you keep rising when staying down would have been the logical choice?" Yuna was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was thoughtful rather than defiant. "May I ask you something first?" Kethvorn blinked, because no one had asked his permission for anything in decades, and he found himself nodding before he had consciously decided to agree. "What did you hope to accomplish today?" Yuna asked. "Not the official purpose, but the real purpose. The one that made you visit this academy personally instead of sending a subordinate." The general was silent for a long time, and Yuna waited with the patience of someone who had all the time in the universe. "I wanted to see what humans were made of," he finally admitted. "My people have heard stories about Earth's children for years now. Tales of soldiers who charge into certain death while laughing, of colonies that refuse to surrender even when surrounded, of a species that treats overwhelming odds as merely an inconvenience." He paused and looked at his own hands. Massive implements of destruction that had ended thousands of lives across dozens of worlds. "I thought the stories were propaganda," he continued. "I thought your species had simply been lucky, or had exaggerated its accomplishments as so many young species do. And I wanted to find the truth beneath the legends." "And what did you find?" Yuna asked. Kethvorn raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something in those amber depths that had not been there before. "I found a girl half my size who took everything I gave her and asked for more," he said. "I found a species that does not understand the concept of inevitable defeat. And I found something that I have not encountered in 300 years of warfare." "What is that?" "An equal." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood, yet Yuna let the silence stretch before she responded. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm it always did. Humans do not survive by being the strongest or the fastest. She said, we survive by refusing to stop. And our ancestors learned this lesson over millions of years on a world that tried constantly to kill them. She touched the cut on her forehead, wincing slightly at the pain but not looking away from the general. We have a form of hunting called persistence hunting. She continued, our ancestors would chase prey for days across the savannah, never catching up but never falling behind, until eventually the animal collapsed from exhaustion and could not run anymore. I have read about this, HFY said. It seems an inefficient method compared to ambush predation. Perhaps, Yuna agreed. But it teaches a different lesson than ambush hunting does. Because the ambush predator learns that if the first strike fails, then the prey escapes and you go hungry. While the persistence predator learns that failure is simply an opportunity to continue. She stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. And her next words carried no challenge or accusation, but only genuine curiosity. What are the Draconori running from that you need to prove your strength so badly? HFY went completely still, his massive body frozen in a way that had nothing to do with predatory instincts. And for a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the station's life. Support systems, no one had ever asked him that question. Not in 3 centuries of command, not in thousands of battles, not in any negotiation or surrender or victory celebration. The Draconori did not run from anything. That was the foundation of their entire civilization, the bedrock upon which their empire was built. And yet this small human had looked at that foundation and asked what cracks it might be hiding. I do not know how to answer that, HFY said finally, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. No one has ever asked before. Yuna nodded as if this was exactly the response she had expected. And she began walking toward the medical station along the wall. Perhaps you should think about it, she said without looking back. I need to get my injuries treated, and I suspect you have much to consider before tomorrow. She paused at the door and turned to face him one last time, for what it is worth. General, I do not think your species is beyond hope, because anyone who can recognize an equal has already taken the first step toward becoming something greater. Then she was gone, and HFY sat alone in the empty arena, staring at the bloodstains on the floor and wondering why a question from a battered human girl weighed more heavily on him than anything he had experienced in 300 years of conquest. The answer, when it finally came to him hours later, was simple and terrible and true. He was running from the fear that strength alone was not enough to last forever. The combat evaluation chamber was a circular arena with walls that rose 30 feet high and seating that could accommodate 500 observers. And on this morning, every seat was filled with cadets and faculty who had heard rumors about what had happened in classroom. 7 General HFY stood in the center of the ring, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the harsh lights, and his 2 guards flanked the entrance like statues carved from living stone. The assessment is simple, the general announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber without any need for amplification. Each cadet will enter this ring and face me in single combat, and you need only remain standing for 30 seconds to pass. A murmur rippled through the crowd, because 30 seconds did not sound like very long. But those who knew the Draconori understood that it might as well be 30 years when facing a warrior of HFY's caliber. I will not kill anyone today, the general continued, but I will demonstrate the physical superiority that justifies the natural order of the galaxy. And perhaps some of you will learn valuable lessons about your place within that order. The first cadet was called forward, a young Marathi who walked to the ring on legs that could barely support his weight. And when he stepped through the entrance, his skin had gone completely gray with terror. HFY did not even need to strike him, because the Marathi took one look at the general's fighting stance and collapsed to his knees in immediate surrender. 3 seconds, the general said with contempt. Next, one by one the cadets entered the ring, and one by one they fell. Not through any great violence on HFY's part, but through their own overwhelming fear and physical inadequacy. The Volkith froze completely, their instincts telling them to play dead in the presence of a predator. And they had to be carried from the arena after failing to move. For the entire 30 seconds, a pair of Fenari cadets tried to work together and lasted perhaps 10 seconds before a single sweep of the general's arms sent them both tumbling across the floor. The Koran-named breath showed genuine courage, charging at HFY with a war cry that echoed off the walls. But the general sidestepped his rush and delivered a single strike to his back that dropped him like a puppet with its strings cut. 7 seconds. HFY announced. Better, but not good enough. The assessments continued through the morning, and the pattern remained consistent, with no cadet lasting more than 12 seconds and most failing within the first 5. Talvin managed 8 seconds through pure determination before a light tap to his chest sent him sprawling. And Chira could not even enter the ring without their legs giving out beneath them. Then the name was called that everyone had been waiting for. Cadet Una Park of Earth. The announcer said, "Please enter the assessment ring." The chamber went completely silent as Una stood from her seat in the front row and walked toward the entrance with the same calm stride she used for everything else. She wore the standard cadet training uniform, which only emphasized how small she was compared to the massive Draconori waiting in the ring. And her dark hair was pulled back in a simple practical style that kept it out of her eyes. HFY watched her approach with an expression that might have been anticipation. And when she stepped through the entrance and took her position across from him, something changed in the atmosphere of the arena. "Human," the general said, "I have studied your species since we last met, and I have learned interesting things about the creatures from Earth." Una said nothing but simply settled into a basic defensive stance that left her hands open and her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. "Your people are persistence predators," HFY continued, circling her slowly like a shark examining potential prey. "You chase your targets until they collapse from exhaustion, never faster but always relentless. And I wonder if this extends to combat as well." He struck without further warning, a blow that moved almost too fast for the observers to follow, and gasps echoed through the chamber as Una's body twisted to one side. She did not dodge the strike completely, because that would have been impossible, but she deflected enough of the force that instead of breaking bones, it merely sent her staggering backward. She caught her balance and returned to her stance. Without a word, 5 seconds had passed. HFY's eyes narrowed, because most species would have been on the ground from that single hit. And he struck again with a sweeping motion aimed at her legs. Una jumped, taking the blow on her thigh instead of her knee, and she rolled with the impact rather than fighting it, coming up on one knee before rising to her feet once more. 10 seconds. "You know how to fall," the general observed. And there was something new in his voice that might have been interest. He attacked more seriously now, a combination of strikes that would have overwhelmed most trained warriors. And Una made no attempt to block or counter any of them. Instead, she moved with the hits, taking them on her arms and shoulders and sides, letting herself be pushed and spun and knocked back, but never letting herself be knocked down. Blood began to flow from a cut on her forehead, where a glancing blow had split the skin, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand and maintained her stance 15 seconds. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this tiny, human absorbed punishment that would have incapacitated larger and stronger species. And something began to stir in the hearts of the cadets who had already failed their own assessments. 20 seconds, HFY increased the power of his strikes. no longer holding back as much as he had with the other cadets. And Yuna took a hit directly to her ribs that lifted her off her feet and sent her crashing to the floor. The chamber held its collective breath. Yuna lay still for one heartbeat. Then two, and then she placed her hands flat against the floor and pushed herself upward, rising first to her knees and then to her feet with movements that were slower than before, but no less determined. She was bleeding from multiple small wounds now, and her breathing had become labored. But her eyes remained fixed on the general with that same expression of calm observation. 25 seconds. "Why do you not stay down?" Cathvorin demanded, and his voice carried a note of genuine confusion. "You cannot defeat me. You cannot even hurt me. So what purpose does this serve?" Yuna wiped more blood from her eyes and settled back into her stance. Saying nothing at all. 28 seconds. The general struck one more time, a blow that caught her in the shoulder and spun her completely around, and she fell to one knee with her hand braced against the floor to keep from collapsing entirely. 29 seconds. She looked up at him from that position, her face bruised and bleeding, her body shaking with pain and exhaustion, but her eyes still clear and her expression still unchanged. 30 seconds. The tone sounded to signal the end of the assessment, and Yuna Park rose to her feet one final time and stood facing the Draconori general who had just tried his best to break her. She had not thrown a single punch. She had not landed a single strike, and by any objective measure, she had been utterly dominated in the exchange. But she was still standing. Cathvorin stared at the small human who had done the impossible, who had endured what no other cadet could endure. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to say. The chamber remained frozen in silence as the general and the human faced each other across the blood-stained floor of the arena. And something fundamental shifted in the way every species present understood the natural order of the galaxy. The shuttle descended through the docking bay of Concordance Prime with the silence of a predator entering a watering hole, and every species on the station felt the shift in the air before they even knew who had arrived. Cadet Yuna Park sat in her usual seat near the window of Classroom 7. Her tablet opened to a chapter on interstellar treaty law that she had already read twice that morning, and she noticed the way her classmates began to fidget and whisper before the announcement came through the speakers. "Attention all personnel." The station voice declared in 17 languages. Simultaneously, General Cathvorin of the Draconori Empire has arrived for an unscheduled inspection of the Galactic Integration Academy, and all cadets are to remain in their current locations until further notice. The reaction was immediate and impossible to miss. Beside Yuna, a Marathi cadet named Talvin turned 3 shades paler, his amphibian skin losing its healthy blue-green shimmer and fading to something closer to gray, and his webbed hands began to tremble against the desk surface across the aisle. The insectoid Velkith called Chirik made a rapid clicking sound that Yuna had learned to recognize as extreme distress, and their compound eyes darted toward the door as if calculating escape routes. "This cannot be happening," Talvin whispered, his voice barely audible. Cathvorin is the conqueror of the 12 systems, the general who broke the Fanari resistance in a single campaign. And they say he comes to academies specifically to remind young species of their place in the hierarchy. Yuna looked up from her tablet and watched her classmates with quiet curiosity, noting how even the larger species in the room seemed to shrink into themselves at the mention of this name. She had been at the academy for only 6 months, one of 3 humans selected for the prestigious program that trained future diplomats and leaders from across the galaxy. And in that time, she had learned that the universe operated on principles very different from those she had known on her colony world of New Bazan, here among the stars. Strength was everything, and the Draconori sat at the very top of that brutal hierarchy. The classroom door slid open without warning, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees as General Kethvorin entered the room. He stood 8 feet tall at minimum, his scaled hide the color of dried blood, and his eyes burned with the amber intensity of a dying sun. And when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of something that had never once in its existence needed to fear another living creature. Behind him walked 2 Draconori soldiers in ceremonial armor, their presence clearly meant to intimidate. Though the general himself needed no such support, Kethvorin surveyed the classroom with obvious contempt, his gaze passing over each species and dismissing them in turn. And when he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder across a battlefield. "So these are the future leaders of the galaxy," he said. And the translator implants rendered his words with perfect clarity while somehow preserving the mockery in his tone. "I see Morathi, who will negotiate surrenders, Velkith, who will count casualties, and other soft creatures who will learn to serve their betters." No one responded, and no one dared to meet his eyes. The instructor, a scholarly being from a species Yuna could not name, had pressed himself against the far wall and made no move to assert any authority over his own classroom. Kethvorin walked between the rows of desks, and cadets leaned away from him as he passed, their bodies responding to ancient instincts that recognized an apex predator in their midst. "I am here to assess the readiness of this institution," the general announced. "The Draconori Empire has concerns that the Academy is producing weakness rather than strength, and I intend to determine whether those concerns are justified." He stopped beside a Corvan cadet, a species known for their size and physical power, and the young Corvan was shaking so badly that his desk rattled against the floor. "Stand." Kethvorin commanded. The Corvan stood on trembling legs, and despite being nearly 7 feet tall himself, he seemed small next to the Draconori general. "Show me your combat stance," Kethvorin ordered. The Corvan tried to comply, raising his arms in what might have been a defensive posture, but his movements were clumsy with fear. And after 3 seconds, Kethvorin made a sound of disgust and shoved the cadet back into his seat with a single hand. "Pathetic," the general declared. "Is there no one in this room who understands what it means to face a superior force without cowering like prey?" His gaze continued to sweep the room, passing over hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, until it landed on the one figure who had not moved since he entered Unipark, sat exactly as she had been sitting before, her posture relaxed but attentive, her hands resting calmly on her tablet, and her dark eyes watched the general with an expression that held neither fear nor challenge. It was simply observation, the look of someone studying an interesting phenomenon. Kethvorin went still in the way that predators do when something unexpected catches their attention. And then he began walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. The cadets between them scrambled to clear a path. And within seconds, Yuna sat alone in a bubble of empty space with the most feared military commander in the known galaxy bearing down on her position. He stopped directly in front of her desk and looked down from his massive height, and his shadow fell across her like a promise of violence. "Human," he said, and the word carried the weight of an accusation. "You do not move, you do not tremble, and you do not lower your eyes in the presence of your superior." Yuna tilted her head slightly to maintain eye contact, a gesture that required her to look almost straight up, and she said nothing at all. "Do your people not understand what happens to prey species who show no deference to predators?" Kethvorin asked, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and far more dangerous. Still Yuna did not speak, and still she did not look away. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 20, and the other cadets watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as this small human girl refused to break under pressure that had crumbled beings twice her size. Finally, Kethvorin straightened and stepped back, and something that might have been interest flickered in his amber eyes. "I will return tomorrow for individual combat assessments. he announced to the room. Though his gaze remained fixed on Yuna, every cadet will demonstrate their worthiness to train among the stars. And those who fail will learn lessons they will carry for the rest of their short lives. He turned and walked toward the door, but paused at the threshold to look back over his shoulder. I particularly look forward to teaching the human a lesson about the natural order of the galaxy, he said. It seems her species has not yet learned where they belong. Then he was gone, and the classroom erupted into panicked chatter. But Yuna simply returned her attention to her tablet and continued reading about interstellar treaty law as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The dormitory common room buzzed with nervous energy that evening as cadets from a dozen different species gathered to discuss what had happened in Classroom 7 and what it might mean for their futures. Yuna sat in her usual corner with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, and she listened to her friends argue about her fate with a patience that seemed to frustrate them more than anything else. You have to apologize, Talvin insisted, his amphibian features tight with worry. Before the assessment tomorrow, you must find General Kethvorn and beg his forgiveness for your disrespect, because it is the only way you might survive. Chirrut clicked in agreement, their mandibles moving rapidly as they spoke through their translator device. The Draconuri have killed cadets during assessments before and faced no consequences from the council. And your silence today was interpreted as a challenge that he cannot ignore without losing face among his subordinates. I did not challenge him, Yuna said quietly. I simply did not perform the submission he expected. To the Draconuri, there is no difference, said a Corvan cadet named Breath, still visibly shaken from his own encounter with the general. Their entire culture is built on dominance hierarchies, and when you refuse to acknowledge his superiority, you essentially declared yourself his equal or his enemy. Yuna took a sip of her cold tea and considered this information with the same calm she had shown in the classroom, and her friends exchanged looks of increasing desperation. Why? Talvin finally asked. Why did you show no fear when everyone else was terrified? Because I have seen you react to surprises, and I know you are capable of being startled. So what made this different? Yuna was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice carried the weight of memory. I grew up on New Bizon, she said. It is a colony world on the edge of human space. And when I was very young, the scourge came. The other cadets went still, because even species who knew little about humanity had heard of the scourge, the parasitic hive mind that had swept through 3 sectors before being stopped at tremendous cost. My grandmother survived the occupation, Yuna continued. For 2 years, she lived under their control, watching neighbors taken and transformed, never knowing if each day would be her last. And when the liberation forces finally came, she was one of only 800 survivors from a colony of 50,000. How did she endure? Chirrut asked softly. She taught me that fear is a gift, Yuna said. It is something you give to those who want to control you, and some people deserve no gifts at all. So when I looked at General Kethvorn, I saw someone who wanted my fear like a hungry man wants food. And I decided he had not earned it. The room fell silent as the cadets absorbed this perspective, and several of them looked at the small human girl with new understanding in their eyes. Meanwhile, in the station's central archive, General Kethvorn was conducting research of his own. The archivist was an ancient being called Sorinthi, who had served Concordance Prime for over 3 centuries. And they floated before a massive holographic display that showed everything the galactic database contained about the species called humanity. You asked for threat assessments and cultural analyses, Sorinthi said in a voice like rustling leaves. I must admit the human file is quite extensive for such a young spacefaring species. Kethvorn stood with his arms crossed, his amber eyes scanning the data streams with growing unease. Tell me about their homeworld, Earth is classified as a Category 4 death world, Sorrenti replied. High gravity, extreme temperature variations, abundant predators, toxic plant life, and a star that bombards the surface with radiation. And yet humans not only survived there, but thrived and eventually dominated the entire planet. Many species come from harsh worlds, Kethvorin said dismissively. Indeed. But humans display several traits that are quite rare in the galactic community, Sorrenti continued. They are classified as persistence predators, which means their ancestors hunted not through speed or strength, but through endurance, literally chasing prey for days until the target collapsed from exhaustion. The general's eyes narrowed, because the Draconori hunted through ambush and overwhelming force, and the concept of simply refusing to stop until victory was achieved was deeply foreign to his understanding. There is more, Sorrenti said. And the holographic display shifted to show a psychological profile. Humans exhibit what researchers call threat response inversion, which means that under sufficient pressure, their fear responses can convert entirely to aggression. Essentially, they become more dangerous when cornered rather than less. Show me combat footage. Kethvorin ordered. Sorrenti complied, and the display filled with recordings from various human conflicts. Images of soldiers holding positions against impossible odds while laughing and making jokes. Footage of wounded humans refusing evacuation to continue fighting. Documentation of civilians forming resistance. Movements against superior occupying forces. One clip showed a group of human soldiers surrounded and outnumbered 10-1. And instead of surrendering, they charged directly into the enemy formation with weapons blazing and war cries on their lips. Insanity, Kethvorin muttered. But his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, Sorrenti agreed. Or perhaps a different form of sanity entirely. Because humans have a saying that translates roughly to the fact that it is not the size of the fighter, but the size of the fight in the fighter that matters. The general watched as a human no larger than the girl he had confronted today pulled a wounded comrade twice her size through a kilometer of enemy territory, while under constant fire, refusing to leave them behind, despite every logical reason to do so. They have another saying, Sorrenti added, that humans do not know when to quit. And in the context of galactic survival, this may be their greatest strength. Kethvorin turned away from the display and walked to the viewport that looked out over the station, his reflection staring back at him with an expression he barely recognized. He had come to the academy expecting to find weakness to exploit and spirits to break. But instead, he had found a species that seemed to treat overwhelming force as merely another obstacle to overcome. The girl had not shown fear because she genuinely did not feel it. At least not in the way he understood fear. And tomorrow, when he faced her in the assessment ring, he would learn exactly what that meant. Alchemist, he said without turning around. Have humans ever lost a war of extinction? No, General, Sorrenti replied. They have lost many battles and several wars. But when facing total annihilation, they have always found a way to survive and eventually prevail. Even against the scourge. Kethvorin said nothing more. But as he left the archive, his stride carried less certainty than it had when he arrived. And somewhere in his ancient predator brain, a new emotion was beginning to form. It was not quite fear, because the Draconori did not fear anything. But it was perhaps the beginning of respect for something he did not yet fully understand.